If you watched our last video, you saw how David, the forgotten shepherd boy, became Israel's greatest king. But today we shift our focus to his son, a man born in a palace, raised in luxury, given everything, yet lost it all. This is the story of Solomon, the third king of Israel, the man who built the greatest empire in Israel's history, yet ended his life as a cautionary tale. He was the wisest king who ever lived, but also one of the most foolish. How is that possible? Solomon's reign began with power, prosperity, and unmatched wisdom straight from God himself. He was the king who ruled an era of gold, peace, and unimaginable success. But something went terribly wrong. His hunger for power, his obsession with wealth, and his love for foreign women would lead him down a path of destruction. So the question remains, was Solomon Israel's greatest king, or its greatest tragedy? We put timestamps in the description so you can jump to different parts of this video. If you know someone who is on the verge of losing everything, just like Solomon did, share this video with them. Let history be a warning. We've converted our most popular videos into eBooks to help you study deeper, so check the link below. If you'd like this video in ebook format, let us know in the comments. And if you want to support this channel so we can continue making powerful content to bring people closer to God, you can use the link below. Now let's dive deep into the rise and fall of King Solomon, a story like no other. Solomon's story doesn't begin with glory. It begins with scandal. Long before he was born, before he ever held a scepter or sat on a throne, his parents, King David and Bathsheba, were at the center of one of the most shocking and devastating scandals in Israel's history. A king's lust, a woman's sorrow, a husband's murder, and a child born from it all. David had been a righteous king, a man after God's own heart. But even the greatest can fall. One night he saw Bathsheba, a beautiful woman, bathing on a rooftop. Instead of looking away, instead of walking in righteousness, David took her. But Bathsheba was not just any woman. She was the wife of Uriah, one of David's most loyal warriors. And when she became pregnant, David panicked. He tried to cover it up, calling Uriah back from war, hoping he would sleep with his wife and believe the child was his. But Uriah refused to go home, saying he couldn't enjoy his wife while his fellow soldiers were still in battle. David, once a shepherd boy who trusted in God, had now become a man who relied on deception. When his plan failed, he did something unthinkable. He arranged Uriah's death. He sent him to the front lines, ordering his commander to pull back so Uriah would be killed, a murder disguised as war. David took Bathsheba as his wife, but God was watching, and he sent the prophet Nathan with a message that shook David to his core. "You are the man," 2 Samuel 12:7. Nathan exposed everything. God saw it all, and he declared judgment. The child conceived in sin would die. And he did. Bathsheba wept, David wept. The weight of sin had crashed down upon them. But even in judgment, God's mercy was at work. Bathsheba conceived again. This time, a child was born, not in scandal, but in restoration. His name Solomon. Unlike the first child who was taken in judgment, Solomon was a child of promise. But why Solomon? Why, out of all of David's sons, was this one chosen to be king? David had many sons. In human terms, the firstborn should have been king. His oldest son Amnon was the natural heir. But Amnon was wicked, committing an unspeakable crime against his own sister. God rejected him. His next son, Absalom, was charismatic and powerful. He even led a rebellion against his own father to take the throne. But he was consumed by pride, and he too was struck down. One by one, David's older sons fell, and God's choice became clear. Solomon wasn't the strongest. Solomon wasn't the oldest. Solomon wasn't the most obvious choice. But Solomon was the chosen one. And it was confirmed by Nathan the prophet, the same man who had once condemned David for his sin. Now Nathan would play a role in securing Solomon's destiny. David was old, his strength was failing, and one of his other sons, Adonijah, decided it was time to take the kingdom for himself. He declared himself king while David was still alive, gathering military leaders and priests to support him. It was a full-scale coup. But Nathan and Bathsheba acted fast. They went before David and reminded him of God's promise that Solomon was meant to be king. David, though weak, took action immediately. He called Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the warrior, and commanded them to take Solomon, anoint him with oil, and seat him on the throne. And so Solomon was crowned king, while Adonijah was still celebrating his own fake coronation. Adonijah heard the noise, the trumpets blasting, the people shouting, "Long live King Solomon!" And he knew he had lost. Solomon was no longer just a child of scandal. He was now a child of destiny. The world had seen him as a reminder of David's darkest moment, but God had turned it into a symbol of his grace. Solomon's birth was proof that God can take what is broken and make it whole, that God can take what began in failure and transform it into something glorious. But the question remained, would Solomon stay faithful to the God who had chosen him? Or would he let his power corrupt him? The story of Israel's most glorious yet most tragic king was only beginning. The battle for the throne was far from over. Solomon may have been anointed king, but power is never handed over easily. There were still those who believed the throne belonged to someone else, and in the shadows men plotted. Blood would be spilled before Solomon could truly rule. Adonijah had declared himself king first. It had been a bold, reckless move. He was David's oldest surviving son. In his eyes, the throne was his birthright. While David lay weak and dying, Adonijah had already begun his coronation. He gathered military leaders, powerful priests, and Israel's nobility, hosting a massive feast to celebrate his victory. But Adonijah's greatest mistake, he did not invite Solomon. It was a clear message. He saw Solomon as a threat. But while Adonijah feasted, drank, and celebrated, news came that shattered everything. The trumpets had sounded. The people of Jerusalem were shouting in the streets, "Long live King Solomon!" It was over. David had given the command. Solomon was the rightful king. When Adonijah heard what had happened, his heart dropped. The people had turned. The throne was no longer his. His supporters abandoned him instantly. He ran, not to his warriors, not to his allies, but to the only place he thought he could be safe. The altar of God. Adonijah grabbed hold of the horns of the altar and refused to let go. In ancient Israel, this was a desperate plea for mercy. It was an unspoken rule. No one could be killed while holding the altar. He sent word to Solomon, "Swear to me that you will not put me to death." The entire nation waited for Solomon's answer. Would he show mercy, or would he send a message? Solomon chose mercy on one condition. If he proves himself worthy, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. Adonijah swore loyalty, for now the bloodshed was avoided. But it would not last. David was fading. The man who had slain giants, conquered nations, and ruled Israel for 40 years was now a frail, dying old man. Before he took his last breath, he called Solomon to his side, and he did not speak as a father, but as a king. "I am about to go the way of all the earth, so be strong, show yourself a man, walk in obedience to the Lord your God." 1 Kings 2:2-3. Solomon listened, but then David's voice darkened. There were loose ends, men who had betrayed David, men who had defied God. You know what Joab son of Zeruiah did to me. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his grey head go down to the grave in peace. And Shimei, you must bring his blood down to the grave in judgment." David was handing Solomon more than just a crown. He was handing him a list of men who had to die. Then David closed his eyes, and Israel's greatest king breathed his last. With David gone, Solomon did what he had to do. First, Adonijah. Solomon had spared him once, but Adonijah wasn't done scheming. He made a move, a subtle, dangerous move. He went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. He asked her to request something from the king. "Let me marry Abishag, the young woman who cared for David in his final days." It sounded innocent, but Solomon saw it for what it was. This was a power play. In ancient times, taking the former king's concubine was a declaration of kingship. Adonijah had not learned his lesson. Solomon did not hesitate. "You have spoken this request against your own life." And with a single order, Adonijah was struck down. The first rival was gone. Joab had been one of David's greatest generals, a man of war, a brilliant strategist, but also a man who killed without hesitation. He had murdered Abner. He had murdered Amasa. He had supported Adonijah's rebellion. And now his time had come. Like Adonijah, Joab fled to the altar. He grabbed onto it, refusing to leave. But Solomon gave the command. Benaiah, Solomon's executioner, struck Joab down at the altar. The sins of the past were being wiped away in blood. Only one name remained on David's list, Shimei. He had once cursed David, mocking him as he fled from Absalom's rebellion. David had sworn not to kill him then. But Solomon gave Shimei a choice. "Build a house in Jerusalem, live there, but if you ever leave the city, you will die." Shimei agreed. For 3 years he obeyed, but then he crossed the line. He left Jerusalem for a single night. Solomon kept his word. Shimei was executed, and with that Solomon's enemies were gone. The throne was secured. The time for bloodshed had ended. Now a new era was beginning. Solomon had proven he could be ruthless when necessary, but now he had to prove something far greater. Would he be a just king, a wise ruler, or would power consume him? The golden age of Israel was about to begin, and with it Solomon's greatest test. Solomon had secured the throne with blood, but power alone was not enough. A great king needs more than just strength. He needs wisdom. And Solomon was about to receive a gift from God that would make him legendary. It happened at Gibeon. Solomon had gone there to offer sacrifices, and he did not hold back. 1,000 burnt offerings were placed on the altar, a number so great, so extravagant, that all of Israel took notice. This was not just an act of worship, it was a statement. Solomon was seeking God's favor before he made any great moves as king. That night, as the smoke of the sacrifices still lingered in the air, Solomon fell into a deep sleep. And then it happened. God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you," 1 Kings 3:5. Imagine that. The creator of the universe standing before you, offering you anything. What would you ask for? Would you ask for money, power, or the destruction of your enemies? Solomon could have asked for wealth beyond measure, an empire that would never fall, or even immortality. But he didn't. Instead he said, "I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." 1 Kings 3:7-9. In other words, give me wisdom. He did not ask for riches. He did not ask for glory. He did not ask for revenge. He asked for understanding, and God was pleased. The heavens must have roared with approval, because God did not just grant Solomon wisdom. He gave him everything. "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. But that wasn't all. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. 1 Kings 3:11-13. God poured out his blessings in full. Solomon would not just be the wisest king in Israel, he would be the wisest in all of history. But wisdom is not proven in words, it is proven in actions. And Solomon's first test was about to come. One day, 2 women came before the king, sobbing and screaming. They were both prostitutes living in the same house. Each had given birth to a son. But then tragedy struck. One of the women had rolled over in her sleep, accidentally suffocating her own child. And before dawn, she did the unthinkable. She stole the other woman's baby and placed the dead child in her arms. When the morning light came, the horror set in. The mother of the living child screamed, "This is not my baby!" The other woman shouted back, "Yes, it is!" There were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove who was telling the truth. The case was brought before Solomon. There was no way out of this. Or so they thought. Solomon listened carefully, and then, without hesitation, he gave a command that shocked the entire court. "Bring me a sword." A sword. The guard stepped forward, placing a gleaming blade in the king's hand. The room fell into complete silence. Then Solomon spoke. "Cut the living child in 2. Give half to one woman and half to the other." The crowd gasped. This was insanity. But Solomon wasn't insane. He was watching, because at that moment, the real mother broke. She fell to her knees, weeping. "Please, my lord, give her the baby. Don't kill him." But the other woman, she stood cold and heartless. "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. Solomon had his answer. He pointed to the weeping mother and said, "Give the baby to her. She is his mother." And at that moment all of Israel knew this was no ordinary king. This was the wisest ruler who had ever lived. The news of Solomon's judgment spread like wildfire. People whispered about the king, who knew the truth when no one else did. His name carried power, wisdom, and fear, and his legend was only beginning, because Solomon's wisdom was not just in justice, it was in knowledge, science, poetry, and leadership. He would soon write Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. He would speak 3,000 proverbs and compose 1,005 songs. He would study the mysteries of creation, plants, animals, and the deep secrets of nature. And kings from every corner of the world would come to hear the wisdom of Solomon. The kingdom had never seen such glory. But with wisdom comes power, and with power, the temptation to fall. Solomon had been given everything, but would he hold on to it, or would he let it slip away? The rise of Solomon had begun, but his greatest challenges were yet to come. Solomon had risen to the throne in wisdom, justice, and divine favor, but his rule would soon transcend anything Israel had ever seen. For the first time in history, Israel was not just a small kingdom in the Middle East. It was the wealthiest, most powerful, and most influential empire of its time. This was the golden age of Israel. And it was all because of one man. Before Solomon, Israel had been a nation fighting for survival. Under King Saul, it had been unstable, torn by battles with the Philistines and by its own king's paranoia. Under King David, Israel had conquered its enemies and established itself as a regional power. But under Solomon, Israel became an empire, no longer a kingdom, just trying to survive, but a center of wealth, knowledge, and influence unlike anything the world had seen before. What made Solomon different? It wasn't his strength in war, it was his mastery of peace. Because where David had won battles with the sword, Solomon won them with diplomacy. Solomon understood something that most kings never did: War was expensive. Conquering nations required blood, resources, and years of struggle. But what if there was another way to rule the world? Instead of fighting nations, Solomon befriended them. Instead of conquering, he traded. And no kingdom in history had ever done it so successfully. Egypt, Tyre, Arabia, and surrounding nations flooded Israel with gold, silver, and exotic goods. Solomon married princesses from powerful nations, securing political alliances that made Israel untouchable. Israel became a global trading hub, connecting the great empires of the ancient world. And the wealth that poured into Israel was staggering. It wasn't just land trade that made Israel rich. Solomon built a navy, one that rivaled even the fleets of Phoenicia and Egypt. His ships sailed far beyond the known world, reaching places as distant as India and Africa. The Bible even records that Solomon's ships returned with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks, luxuries that no other nation had seen. Israel had gone from a small kingdom in the desert to a naval superpower controlling international trade. This was something unthinkable for a nation that had once been enslaved in Egypt. And yet, under Solomon, it became reality. With unlimited wealth flowing into his kingdom, Solomon embarked on a building project that would redefine Israel forever. First, the Temple of the Lord, the most sacred structure in Israel's history. Built with cedars from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, and the finest stones ever cut. A temple so majestic, so breathtaking, that it became one of the wonders of the ancient world. But Solomon didn't stop there. His royal palace was just as extravagant. He built fortified cities, aqueducts, public buildings, and roads, transforming Israel into a modern metropolis. And then there was his throne, a masterpiece of gold and ivory, lined with 12 lions, leading up to his seat of power, a throne so magnificent that no other king on earth had anything like it. Solomon wasn't just ruling Israel, he was ruling civilization itself. Word of Solomon's greatness spread far beyond Israel's borders. One of the most famous visitors was the Queen of Sheba. She had heard the rumors, the stories of a king so wise, so powerful, and so wealthy that his kingdom defied imagination. But she didn't believe it, so she came to see for herself. With a massive caravan of gold, spices, and precious stones, the Queen of Sheba entered Jerusalem, expecting to find exaggeration. Instead, she was left speechless. "I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard." 1 Kings 10:7. She had never seen such wisdom, such riches, such power, and she had ruled an empire herself. The greatest rulers on earth came to sit at Solomon's feet, to hear his wisdom, to witness his empire. For a moment in time, Israel was the center of the world. But how long could it last? Because wealth and power are dangerous, and Solomon was about to learn that firsthand. Solomon had it all: wisdom, wealth, power, peace. But with great success comes great danger, because prosperity breeds complacency, power invites compromise. And Solomon, once the wisest king in history, was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. His kingdom was at its peak, but his heart was beginning to turn. He had built an empire, but now he was about to build his downfall. How did the greatest king in history lose everything? The answer is in the next chapter of Solomon's life. For centuries, Israel had worshipped God in a tent, a temporary tabernacle built in the wilderness under Moses. It was a sacred place, but it was never meant to be permanent. David, the great warrior king, had longed to build a house for God, a place where his presence would dwell forever. But David was a man of war, and so God told him, "You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, but your son, whom I will set on your throne, will build the temple for my name." 1 Chronicles 22, 8-10. Now that moment had arrived. Solomon, the wisest, wealthiest king in Israel's history, was about to build something that would stand as a wonder of the ancient world. A structure so magnificent, so unlike anything the earth had ever seen, that it would declare to all nations, "This is the house of the Almighty God." But the temple would not just be a building of stone and gold. It would be a test of Solomon's heart. Would he remain faithful to the God who had given him everything? Or would the very wealth and power that built the temple become his greatest downfall? Solomon didn't waste a moment. The moment his kingdom was established, he began preparing to build the greatest temple in history. He summoned artisans from every land, bringing the finest craftsmen from Tyre, Phoenicia, and beyond. He recruited over 180,000 workers, laborers, stonemasons, and metalworkers to complete the project. The materials, only the best of the best, cedar and cypress from Lebanon, the finest wood in the world, massive stones perfectly cut and polished, so precise they fit together without mortar, gold from Ophir, silver from Sheba, bronze from Egypt, wealth beyond comprehension. For 7 years the work continued, and when it was finished there was nothing like it on earth. The dimensions alone were staggering, 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. 1 Kings 6, 2. But the grandeur, indescribable. The entire inner sanctuary was covered in pure gold. The altar, the walls, even the floor, gold, gold, and more gold. Massive cherubim, 15 feet high, overshadowed the Ark of the Covenant. Lavish decorations, carved palm trees, pomegranates, and intricate floral designs. 10 golden lampstands, 10 golden tables, golden chains, golden doors. It was a palace fit for a king. But it was not for Solomon. This was God's house, a symbol of his presence on earth. And now it was time to dedicate it. After 7 years of construction, the temple was complete. It was time for the most important moment in Israel's history. Solomon gathered all of Israel, priests, elders, leaders, and thousands of worshippers. Then, in a grand procession, the Ark of the Covenant, the very throne of God on earth, was carried into the most holy place. The people watched in silence, and then something happened. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. 1 Kings 8, 10-11. A thick, radiant cloud, the very presence of God, descended upon the temple. It was so powerful, so overwhelming, that even the priests had to stop what they were doing. God had come. At that moment, Solomon could have basked in his own glory. After all, he had built the most magnificent structure in history, one that no other king had ever dreamed of. But instead, he knelt before God, before the entire nation. Solomon stretched out his hands and prayed, "Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built." 1 Kings 8:23-27. Even in his greatest moment, Solomon knew this temple, as grand as it was, could never contain the fullness of God. But he asked for one thing: when your people pray toward this temple, hear from heaven and forgive them. 1 Kings 8:30. And then fire fell from heaven. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. 2 Chronicles 7:1. The people fell on their faces, worshipping, shouting, and praising, and for a moment in time, Israel was exactly where it was meant to be, under the blessing and presence of God. As the celebration continued, God appeared to Solomon in a dream, and he gave a promise and a warning. I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple of sacrifices. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. It was a promise of restoration, that no matter what happened, if Israel turned back to God, he would forgive them. But then came the warning, "But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you, then I will uproot Israel from my land, and this temple will become a heap of rubble." 2 Chronicles 7:19-21. The people rejoiced. They couldn't imagine a day when Israel would turn away from God. But God already knew what was coming, and the question that hung in the air was this: would Solomon, the king who had built the most glorious temple in history, stay faithful? Or would he be the very reason the temple would one day be destroyed? The answer would change everything. Word had spread across the world. The stories were impossible to ignore. A king unlike any other had risen in Israel, a man of unmatched wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and divine favor. A king so powerful that nations bowed before him, eager to trade and learn from his unmatched intellect. His name? Solomon. And among those who heard these stories was a queen from a distant land. A woman of power, influence, and intelligence, a ruler who had everything, yet still she needed to know. Could the rumors be true? Is there truly a king who surpasses all others? She would not believe it until she saw it with her own eyes. And so, the Queen of Sheba embarked on a journey that would change history. Sheba was no ordinary kingdom. Situated in the region of modern-day Ethiopia or Yemen, it was a land of great wealth and influence, a center of trade for spices, gold, and exotic goods. The queen herself was a woman of immense power. She was not easily impressed. She had seen kings rise and fall, had been courted by rulers who sought alliances, had heard countless men boast of their riches and wisdom. But Solomon, he was different. His wisdom was said to be divine, his riches were beyond comprehension, and his God, the God of Israel, was unlike any other. She had to see for herself. And so she loaded her camels with treasures, gold, spices, and precious stones. She gathered her best scholars, scribes, and servants, and set off on a treacherous journey across deserts and mountains, a journey that spanned nearly 1,500 miles, one of the longest and most dangerous expeditions of the ancient world. But she was determined, and when she arrived in Jerusalem, what she saw left her breathless. The moment she entered Solomon's court, she knew. The rumors hadn't even come close to the truth. The palace was like nothing she had ever seen, a masterpiece of architecture, adorned with gold, ivory, and cedar from the finest lands. The air was filled with the scent of incense, a fragrance of wealth and power. The throne of Solomon, a structure of pure gold, inlaid with ivory, with 12 lions standing beside it, was the most magnificent royal seat on earth. And then there was Solomon himself, a man whose wisdom was evident even in his silence. His eyes held knowledge beyond his years, and when he spoke, even the Queen of Sheba, one of the most powerful rulers in history, was left speechless. She came to test Solomon with hard questions, but when she saw all the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, there was no more breath in her. 1 Kings 10:1-5. For the first time in her life, she was outmatched, and she knew it. The Queen of Sheba had not come to admire gold. She had come to test Solomon, to see if his mind was truly as sharp as they claimed. She brought riddles, mysteries, and problems so complex that they had baffled the wisest minds in her own court. She thought, surely he will falter, but he didn't. Every question she asked, he answered effortlessly. Every riddle she posed, he solved with ease. Every challenge she gave, he conquered. And with each answer, her awe deepened. This was no ordinary man. This was a king appointed by the divine. She finally spoke. "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe it until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told to me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard." 1 Kings 10:6-7. And then she blessed the God of Israel, acknowledging that Solomon's greatness was not his own doing, but the work of a divine hand. This was more than admiration, it was recognition. The gods of Sheba could not compare. The kings of the earth could not rival him. The God of Israel was above them all. But the Queen of Sheba had not come empty-handed. She had brought an offering fit for a king. 120 talents of gold, over 4 tons of pure gold, worth hundreds of millions in today's currency. Countless spices and precious stones, treasures of the highest value, rare incense and perfumes, gifts worthy of a divine ruler. And Solomon, he outgave her. He showered her with gifts even greater than what she had given him. For Solomon was not just a receiver of wealth, he was a giver, a king of abundance. The queen left Jerusalem not just richer in gold, but richer in wisdom. The Queen of Sheba's visit was not just an ancient diplomatic mission, it was a prophecy of the future. Generations later, Jesus Christ would reference her, saying, "The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here." Matthew 12:42. She had recognized true wisdom when she saw it. She had acknowledged the one true God. And yet many in Jesus' time refused to recognize the ultimate king, the one greater than Solomon. Her story was a warning. Would people today recognize true wisdom, or would they reject the king standing before them? Solomon was at the height of his power. His wisdom had drawn kings and queens from across the world. His wealth was unrivaled, but something was beginning to change, because even the wisest man on earth can fall into foolishness. And the Queen of Sheba's visit, it was one of the last great moments of Solomon's reign, before the slow descent into compromise, greed, and destruction. The question was, would Solomon remain faithful to the God who gave him everything, or would he become the very king he was warned never to be? The next chapter of Solomon's life would reveal the answer. He had everything: wealth beyond imagination, wisdom that surpassed every ruler on earth, a kingdom that stretched farther than any Israelite king before or after him. For years, Solomon was unstoppable. He had built the temple, expanded his empire, and earned the admiration of kings and queens across the world. But then he made one mistake, a mistake that would slowly, quietly, but inevitably destroy everything he had built. A mistake so seductive that it didn't feel like a mistake at all. Solomon didn't lose his kingdom through war. He didn't fall because of rebellion. He fell because of love. Or at least what he thought was love. Imagine a wedding. The groom stands tall, the bride is adorned in splendor. But this wasn't just one wedding, and this wasn't just one bride. Over the years, Solomon married 700 women, princesses from foreign lands. And if that wasn't enough, he had 300 concubines, women who lived in his palace but were not fully recognized as wives. 1,000 women. Why? Was it lust? Was it power? The answer was far more complicated. In the ancient world, marriages were about alliances. Kings didn't just marry for love. They married to secure peace, trade, and influence. And Solomon, he was the master of diplomacy. If he married a pharaoh's daughter, Egypt wouldn't attack Israel. If he married a princess of Moab, he could secure their land and resources. If he married an Ammonite or Sidonian woman, their kingdoms would become part of his network of power. Every wedding wasn't just a union, it was a strategy, a way to build a kingdom so powerful that no one could challenge it. It was smart, it was brilliant, and it was also his greatest mistake, because these women didn't just bring their beauty and riches into his palace. They brought their gods. God had been crystal clear about this. You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. 1 Kings 11:2. God wasn't against love, he wasn't against marriage. But he knew what would happen. He knew that Solomon's heart wasn't as strong as he thought it was. And despite all his wisdom, Solomon ignored the warning. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. He still worshipped Yahweh. He still made sacrifices in the temple. But then, a small compromise here, a little tolerance there. A Moabite princess wanted to build a shrine to her god, Chemosh, and Solomon allowed it. An Ammonite queen wanted to honor Molech, so Solomon built an altar. A Sidonian wife wanted to pray to Ashtoreth, and Solomon let it happen. And before long, Jerusalem, the holy city of God, was filled with altars to foreign gods. The same Solomon who built the temple of Yahweh was now building shrines for idols. And slowly, quietly, but inevitably, his heart changed. It happened so gradually he didn't even notice. At first, he still prayed to God, but now he also prayed to Ashtoreth. He still sacrificed in the temple, but now he also made offerings to Chemosh and Molech. How did it happen? How did the man who wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," Proverbs 9:10, become a king who worshipped idols? It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was one small compromise at a time, until one day, Solomon, the wisest man on earth, was no longer wise at all. Solomon thought he was securing his kingdom, but his choices were actually tearing it apart. The God who had given him everything was now watching him give his heart to idols. And God had one final message for Solomon. "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you." 1 Kings 11:11. Not in his lifetime, but in his son's, because what Solomon built his son would destroy. This isn't just ancient history, it's a warning. How many people start with passion for God, only to drift away over time? How many leaders begin with integrity, only to make small compromises that eventually destroy them? How many nations, built on faith and righteousness, slowly allow corruption, greed, and sin to take over? Solomon didn't fall overnight. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon God. It was slow. It was one small step in the wrong direction, until one day he was so far from God that he didn't even recognize himself anymore. And that's the tragedy of Solomon. He had everything, but he lost the one thing that mattered most: his heart. Solomon was still king. He still had his throne, his riches, and his wisdom, but something was different. The blessings that had once flowed so freely were starting to dry up. Enemies began rising against him. His kingdom was no longer at peace, and God had already spoken, "I will tear the kingdom away from you." The golden age of Israel was coming to an end. The cracks were forming in the empire he had built, and soon they would shatter completely. The man who had everything was about to lose it all. The next chapter of Solomon's life would be the most painful yet. Would he turn back to God before it was too late, or would he die a king who had forgotten his first love? Solomon's many wives were not just a political strategy, they were his downfall. Because sin never stays small, compromise always leads to destruction, and when we give our hearts to anything other than God, we lose everything. The question is, are we making the same mistake today? At the height of his power, Solomon had no equal. His wealth was unmatched, his wisdom was legendary, his kingdom was at peace, but power has a way of making men forget. Solomon had everything, yet he was about to lose it all, not to war, not to rebellion, but to his own heart, because while he built the most magnificent temple for God, he also built altars for gods that weren't real. He thought he was securing his kingdom. Instead, he was signing its death sentence, and when God finally spoke, his message was clear, terrifying, and final. Because you have done this, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you. 1 Kings 11:11. Solomon, the wisest man on earth, had become the greatest fool. Imagine the glory of Jerusalem at its peak, the temple covered in gold, shimmering under the sun, the streets overflowing with merchants and treasures from across the world, the people living in peace and prosperity like never before. But beneath the surface, something was wrong, because hidden among the hills of Jerusalem, another sight had appeared. Altars, shrines, temples, not for Yahweh, the God of Israel, but for Molech, for Ashtoreth, for Chemosh. Solomon, the king who had once prayed for wisdom, was now building temples for false gods. How did this happen? How did the man who wrote "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," Proverbs 9:10, end up worshipping idols? The answer was simple: compromise. It started small. A Moabite princess asked to honor her gods. A Sidonian queen requested an altar to Ashtoreth. A wife from Ammon wanted to burn incense to Molech. And Solomon, the great diplomat, wanted to keep the peace. So he allowed it. Just one altar at first, then another, and before he knew it, Jerusalem, the holy city of God, was filled with places of idol worship. And worst of all, Solomon himself began to take part. His wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. 1 Kings 11:4. The king who had built the temple of Yahweh was now bowing before statues of stone. God had been patient, God had been merciful, but now God was angry, and when God is angry, kingdoms fall. Solomon had broken the very first commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me," Exodus 23. He had led Israel into sin. He had betrayed the covenant, and now judgment was coming. God appeared to Solomon one final time, and this time there was no blessing and no promise of wisdom, no reward, only a sentence. "Since you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." 1 Kings 11:11. The golden age of Israel was over. The kingdom would be divided, and it was all because of Solomon. But in one act of mercy, God made a promise: "For the sake of your father David, I will not do this in your lifetime, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son." 1 Kings 11:12. Solomon wouldn't see the fall, but his son would, and what he had built would soon collapse. Not long after God's judgment, a man named Jeroboam entered the picture. He was a servant of Solomon, a strong leader, a man of great skill. And one day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, a prophet named Ahijah appeared. And Ahijah was holding a cloak. He took it off, and in front of Jeroboam, he tore it into 12 pieces. Then he looked at him and said, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." 1 Kings 11:31. Israel would be split. 10 tribes would follow Jeroboam. Only one tribe, Judah, would remain for Solomon's son, Rehoboam. This was the beginning of the end, because after Solomon's death, his empire would be shattered. What happened to Solomon's kingdom is not just history, it is a warning to every leader, to every nation, and to every person. When you turn from God, judgment follows. When you ignore his commands, consequences come. Look at history. How many great empires have risen to power only to fall? Rome, Babylon, Egypt. All of them had power, all of them had wealth, but all of them forgot God. And in the end, all of them crumbled. Solomon's fall is not just a story, it is a pattern. And the question is, are we following the same path? Solomon had started his reign with wisdom, strength, and blessing. He ended it in idolatry, weakness, and judgment. He had everything, and he lost it all, because it doesn't matter how you start, it matters how you finish. And Solomon finished poorly. The golden kingdom he built would not survive him, because when a leader forgets God, the nation falls with him. For 40 years, Solomon ruled an empire of gold. For 40 years, his name was feared and respected across the world. For 40 years, he built, conquered, and expanded, turning Israel into the wealthiest and most powerful nation it had ever been. But now, it was all slipping away. The man who once spoke with God now sat in silence. The king who had written about wisdom now lived in regret. The man who once had the favor of heaven was now a shadow of his former self. Solomon had everything, yet he died empty. How did it all come to this? How did the wisest king in history become the greatest cautionary tale? And in his final days, did Solomon return to God, or did he die separated from the one who made him great? Let's find out. The gold still gleamed in his palace, the servants still bowed before him, the people still called him king. But deep inside, Solomon knew his kingdom was falling apart. The very idols he had built for his foreign wives were now spread across Jerusalem. The God of Israel, whom he once honored, was now just another name among many. The people whispered in the streets, "What happened to our king? Where is the man who once wrote, 'Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom'?" Solomon had everything a man could want, and yet, for the first time in his life, none of it satisfied him. He had 700 wives, yet felt alone. He had palaces beyond imagination, yet felt empty. He had riches beyond measure, yet felt poor in spirit. And in his final days, he began to write. As Solomon reflected on his life, his heart grew heavy with regret. The great cities, the mighty armies, the gold and silver, none of it mattered anymore. And so he picked up his pen and wrote the words that would define his final days. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1:2. The king who had everything now saw it for what it really was, temporary. His words were not filled with pride or victory. They were filled with pain and remorse. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2:10-11. The man who had it all now realized he had nothing, and for the first time in years, Solomon turned his eyes back to God. The Bible does not give us a direct answer to this question. We don't see a dramatic scene where Solomon falls on his knees and cries out for mercy. We don't read about him tearing down the altars of false gods before his death. But what we do have is the book of Ecclesiastes, a book that reads like the diary of a broken man, a king who had wandered far from God, yet in his final years recognized his mistake. His final words in Ecclesiastes give us a glimpse of his final thoughts. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, for God will bring every deed into judgment. Ecclesiastes 12:13-14. The man who once built temples to idols was now saying, "Fear God, obey him, nothing else matters." Did he repent before he died? We can't say for sure, but we know he realized his mistake. We know he understood the truth before it was too late. And in the end, perhaps that was his final gift to us, a warning that wisdom without obedience leads to destruction, a warning that wealth without God leads to emptiness, a warning that even the greatest among us can fall if we forget the one who gave us everything. Solomon's death should have been a peaceful transition of power, but instead it would mark the beginning of Israel's downfall. His son Rehoboam was ready to take the throne. But there was a problem. The people were tired of the heavy taxes Solomon had placed on them, tired of the burdens of his extravagant building projects, tired of a kingdom that, on the surface, looked glorious, but underneath was crumbling. And now they had one simple request for their new king. "Lighten the heavy yoke your father put on us, and we will serve you." 1 Kings 12:4. It was a test of leadership. Would Rehoboam listen? Would he rule with wisdom, like his grandfather David? Would he rule with justice, like his father Solomon once had? Or would he let pride destroy everything Solomon built? His decision would change history forever, and the kingdom Solomon spent a lifetime building would be divided in a matter of days. Solomon's story is not just history, it's a warning for today. How many great leaders start strong, only to fall to temptation? How many nations rise to power, only to crumble from corruption? How many people chase wealth and pleasure, only to find themselves empty and lost? Solomon's mistake was not in being wealthy. It was not in being wise. It was in forgetting the one who gave it all to him. And today we must ask ourselves, are we repeating his mistake? Are we seeking wisdom but ignoring obedience? Are we chasing success but forgetting God? Because in the end, it doesn't matter how much we build. It doesn't matter how much we own. If we don't have God, we have nothing. Solomon's life ended not with a great triumph, but with a whisper of regret. He had once been the greatest king in the world. He had once held the favor of God himself, and yet his final days were spent in reflection, remembering what he had lost. And now his son Rehoboam was on the throne. Would he restore the glory of Israel, or would his foolishness destroy everything Solomon had built? The answer would shake the nation to its core. For centuries, the name Solomon has been synonymous with wisdom, power, and wealth. He was the king who had it all, a man who spoke with God, ruled over a golden empire, and left behind some of the most profound writings in history. But Solomon was also a warning. A man who let wisdom become arrogance, a man who let power become a prison, a man who let wealth become his downfall. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, he gave the world wisdom that has shaped generations. On the other hand, his failures shattered the very kingdom he built. So what does his story truly teach us? Is Solomon a hero or a tragedy? Let's uncover the full impact of Israel's richest king. At the height of Solomon's rule, Israel was at its peak. The kingdom stretched from the Euphrates River to Egypt. Foreign kings paid tribute just to be in Solomon's favor. Merchants from every corner of the world brought goods into his ports. The temple of Yahweh was the most magnificent structure in the ancient world. And Israel, for the first and only time in its history, was a superpower. Solomon's wisdom and diplomacy expanded Israel's influence beyond its borders. His strategic alliances, sealed through marriages, gave him control over trade routes. His navy, built with the help of the Phoenicians, dominated the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Gold from Ophir, silver from Tarshish, and exotic goods from Africa and Arabia flowed into Jerusalem in unimaginable quantities. The world had never seen a king like him, and for a time Solomon seemed unstoppable. But beneath the surface of all this prosperity, cracks were forming, cracks that would soon break the kingdom apart. Even as he ruled the most powerful kingdom on earth, Solomon never stopped writing. His wisdom wasn't just for Israel, it was for the world. His writings have shaped generations, and they still do today. Let's take a look at the 3 books Solomon wrote and what they reveal about his rise, reign, and regrets. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 1:7. Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings, lessons about life, morality, and success. This was Solomon at his best, a young king, full of God's wisdom, eager to guide his people toward righteousness. He teaches about hard work, honesty, humility, and justice. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 15:1. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:5. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid. Proverbs 12:1. His words have been quoted by kings, presidents, and leaders for centuries. But here's the tragic part. As Solomon grew older, he stopped following his own advice. The wise king who warned against chasing wealth, he became obsessed with gold. The king who warned against lust and immoral women, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The king who said to trust in the Lord alone, he built temples to false gods. His wisdom never left him, but his obedience did. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1:2. If Proverbs is Solomon at his peak, then Ecclesiastes is Solomon at rock bottom. Written in his final years, this book is his confession. The wealthiest man in history, he says wealth is meaningless. The most powerful king, he says power is meaningless. The wisest man on earth, he says wisdom is meaningless. And he had everything a man could ever desire. But at the end of his life, he looked back and realized all of it was a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2:11. And then he comes to his final conclusion of fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13. This was Solomon's final warning to us at the end of the day. Success without God is empty. Wealth without God is worthless. Wisdom without obedience is foolishness. The final book Solomon wrote is perhaps the most mysterious. Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, is a poetic love story. It describes the passion, romance, and commitment between a bride and groom. Many believe it symbolizes God's love for his people. But here's the irony. Solomon, the man who wrote the most beautiful love poem in history, was a man who failed in love himself. His obsession with women led him away from God. His many wives led his heart astray. And in the end, the man who wrote about pure love was never satisfied by it. Solomon's story doesn't have a happy ending. The wisest king in history ended in disobedience. The richest man in history ended in regret. The most powerful leader in Israel's history left a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Why? Because he stopped fearing God. He chased pleasure instead of righteousness. He chose compromise over conviction. And in the end, all of it was meaningless. The story of Solomon is not just history, it's a warning for our time. How many leaders start strong only to fall? How many people chase wealth only to feel empty? How many of us seek wisdom but ignore obedience? Solomon's final message to the world was this: fear God, obey his commandments, nothing else matters. Ecclesiastes 12:13. His legacy is one of both greatness and failure. A king who had it all, yet lost everything. A man who was gifted by God, yet forgot God. And today, his story still speaks. Will we learn from him, or will we repeat his mistakes? With Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took the throne. But instead of learning from his father's failures, Rehoboam's pride and foolishness would destroy everything. In just a few short years, the kingdom that Solomon spent a lifetime building would be divided forever. Solomon's story is a warning wrapped in a legacy. He was the king who had it all: wisdom beyond measure, wealth beyond imagination, and power beyond any ruler of his time. And yet, He lost everything, not because of war, not because of a foreign invasion, not even because of betrayal, but because he betrayed himself, because he forgot God. He built the grandest temple, but let his own heart become a shrine for false gods. He wrote words of wisdom, but ignored them in his own life. He ruled a golden empire, but left behind a kingdom ready to collapse. Solomon teaches us a painful truth. Success without faithfulness is just a slow road to disaster. So as we close the chapter on Israel's greatest king, we must ask ourselves, are we chasing wisdom but forgetting obedience? Are we pursuing success but losing our souls in the process? Are we building legacies that will last, or will they crumble the moment we're gone? Because history proves one thing, even the greatest kingdoms will fall if they are not built on God. With Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took the throne. But unlike his father, he had no wisdom. His pride and arrogance would shatter the kingdom in just a few short years. The golden age of Israel was over, and the age of division had begun. Don't miss the next video as we uncover how one king's foolishness destroyed everything Solomon built. If this deep Bible stories video gave you a fresh perspective, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. We've also converted our most popular videos into eBooks, so be sure to check the link in the description. Want this video in ebook format? Let us know in the comments. Till the next video, stay blessed.